Hello, good evening. So, how are you doing, guys? How are you doing today, sir? So, good evening now, guys. So, I've sent the message to everybody to remind them the class has started. So, today we are going to continue with our CSS, how we can add the CSS to our web page. So, the last class we talked about the what the CSS is and what we use CSS to do. We talk about how you can be able to write a CSS code to change the appearance of our HTML wall element. In addition to that, we talk about the syntax of how to create a CSS wall uh, selector. If you are going to apply a CSS to an HTML element, we talk about the rule that is involved in creating the CSS. We say the rule involve defining a selector and defining the block of code that form that particular rule. Because say a selector is just a name we give to a set of rule in CSS. It's like when you are writing your CSS rules, you are going to give it a name. That name you give to it is a selector. So in short, the syntax of the CSS means you have to define the selector and you have to define the rule for that selector. And we say the CSS rule is going to be formed by using the CSS word property and the value. And there are more than thousands of different types of the CSS properties that are available. So we talk about the simple one like this one you see here, which is a font size, is a rule that means the size of the font should be 32 word point. And the selector for that particular rule is anchor word tag here. We also talk about how we can add the CSS to our HTML pages. We say there are three ways of adding the CSS to our HTML page in the last class. We talk about the inline CSS, that is the CSS rule we apply to a particular tag by using star attribute. We also talk about the internal CSS, or we call the embedded CSS. That's the CSS to be applied to a page. That is, if you want to apply CSS to multiple elements within a single page, we use internal CSS. And we also talk about the external CSS. A CSS that can be used to change the appearance of the multiple element in multiple pages. So today, we are going to talk about the selector for this particular CSS. And before we go to the selector, I want us to get more about from this particular site. We call Tutorial Republic. Everything we discussed in the last day about the CSS is there, starting from the introduction to the CSS, and now you can get started with the CSS rule. It's also part of this particular in this particular selector, that is how we can add the CSS to our HTML page by using inline, embedded and the external. Also, there's also another one called what are the syntax of forming a CSS rules. If you are going to add the CSS to your HTML pages, you have to understand the CSS syntax, which consists of selector and the declaration block. While declaration block is made up of the CSS property and their values. Okay, so that is it. So now today we are going to talk about the CSS selector. The selector, what are the selector? Like I said earlier before that selector are just refer to to the name you give to the CSS rule. Because when you are going to run the several type of the CSS rule, you have to apply a particular selector to that CSS rule. You have to give a name to that CSS rule. If I'm writing CSS, there must be a name for it, and that name is what you call a selector. In another definition, you can say the CSS selector is a pattern to mark the element of the web page. When we define a set of pattern, I want that pattern to match a particular element of the web page. That is what we call a selector. And they say the CSS style rule associated with that selector will be applied to the element that match that selector pattern. What we are talking about that for every HTML element we have, we must define the selector that match it. Like for example now, on this page we created the last lab, we have so many HTML elements like header tag, header 1, header 2, and header 3 and HR now. So if I want to apply any CSS to any of these elements, I must define the selector that match it. Good evening. I can hear you. I can hear you. It's network. It's network. I know. So you can still manage it a little bit. So can you hear me now? Or you can disconnect and connect back again. Yeah, that is the problem. That's the network. Maybe it's because of the weather now. Mhm. Maybe because of the weather. Let's see how. Okay. Let's see how it will go for the next 1 hour first. Mhm. So at least maybe 40 minutes. If it's not improved, that means you can just stop this one, continue on Saturday when network will be more better. But what I'm now still talking about now is what still CSS selector, that a CSS selector is just for a pattern. Is a pattern that must match any element on the web page. In addition to that, we say the CSS rule must be associated with the selector, and that selector will be applied to what? To the element, for the selector pattern to affect that element or to change that element. What we are talking about there is that what? This particular element like what? H1 and H2 and H3 and HR, they are all different type of selector. So I must define this, they are all different type of the elements. Sorry for that. So I must define the selector that match them. So any selector I define that match the H1, it means whatever rule on that particular selector H1 will be applied to H1. If I define the selector that match the A2, whatever rule them will be applied to what? To A2. And like example we have in the last class here now, I define a selector here called the H1, and all this rule that is there is now applying to that word H1. That is it. But in CSS, there are different type of the word of the selector. The first selector we have is what we call what? HTML word selector. Or let me just start from that. HTML selector. This HTML selector is referred to element selector. Do you get now? So it means that what? The element selector match all instance of element in the document with the corresponding element type name. What means that what? If I'm going to define a selector like paragraph, if I define paragraph as a selector, P as selector, it means any element that have a P as tag, the whatever rule that is in that particular word selector will be applied to it. That is the word. That is what the element selector word mean. If for example now, I'm writing some code like this, as this section here is my HTML word page, and I have some code like this. I say p tag hello, okay, and here now I close word p tag. I have another one p tag again, okay. I have another p tag again here, another p tag again what here again. So the p tag hello, p tag 2 and p tag 3. So now if I return back here now and now define the CSS word rule here, and also in this I also have another selector called what? HR tag, and there's another selector again I call what? H3 what? Tag here. H3 tag I call the what? For FOUR. That is what? For. So if I'm defining a CSS rule which I want it to what? To change the appearance of all the paragraph, it means that what? I can define a selector called P like this. I will now declare the rule for that P. So the P I declare here mean any of the word, whatever rule I define for this P selector, whatever word the CSS rule I define for this particular P, this is the word P selector. P selector, okay. So whatever the CSS I define for P selector here will be affect all the P tag up here. If for example now I said that what? The P selector color should be what? Red here now. This rule mean that what? Anywhere in HTML whereby there is a tag called P, this particular rule will be applied to it. So once I'm applying this CSS rule to it will affect all this P, and that's why you call it HTML selector or element selector. It means once you declare that selector, the rule in it will apply all the HTML element. But sometimes that is for the pre-selector. But sometimes another selector we have, or that's what we call HTML selector now. So another type of selector we have again is what we call ID selector. The ID selector is used to define the style rule, CSS style rule for a single or unique element, and that can be defined by using hash symbol that must be followed by the ID word value. If you are going to define another selector, which mean I want to give it a rule, this is the ID selector. ID selector can be used to what? To style different element of different types. I want to give them the same word, the same rule. Like for example here again, I want all these particular element here. I want A3, I want one of the paragraph here, I want them to have underline in CSS rule. So I can define ID selector for them. And to define ID selector inside my CSS, I have to use hash symbol for ID selector, and I'm going to use any name. Let me call this one call HTML or element selector. So if I'm going to define the ID selector, I'm going to use hash symbol to define the ID word selector. I will use hash symbol to define the ID word selector. So I will now specify any name of my choice for it. It can be any name. For example, I can say sky. That is the name I'm using now. And I now define the rule for that particular selector. What type of CSS rule I want this selector to carry. So whatever style I want the CSS, whatever CSS style which I want this particular sky ID selector to carry, I will define it here. You get it now? So this sky is any name of your choice. It can be any, as long as you have hash this. I can now come here and say what? Text decoration. Text decoration now. I say column what? Column underline. What this rule mean is that what? I want to apply the underline to some element here. Remember in the first CSS selector here now, when I say P selector and I use the rule as color red, this means any element that is what? That is P here will be affected. But in the second one here, when I say ID and the selector, so for this ID selector to affect some CS from element here, I must use the word, the ID attribute to apply it. And that is one of the rules. So once I define the word, the ID selector, I must, by using the hash symbol, I must use the attribute ID to apply that selector to any word, HTML word element. How do I use the attribute for ID? I will return back to what? To here like this. I can say ID equal in quotation sky. That is one. If I want to apply to this one again, I will say ID equal what? Sky. So this one mean that what? I'm applying the what? The ID selector to what? To these two what? Elements. Now before I go further again, let's now implement this code in our HTML pages. So I'm creating a new HTML page to implement both of them here now. So I'm going to create a new HTML file from what we have in the last class. I'll save this particular one page. I'll save it as element selector now. So okay, file, save as element element selector.html. Okay, in this element selector.html, I'm removing this particular one navigation we have here. So type here and go to the word element selector. Okay, That is it now. So good. So in this element selector, I can write my new CSS style here now. You get it now. This is it now. So let me preview the page first, which I call element selector, and see what output it will return for us. Okay, okay. You can see this one now. Now, I want my element selector. I have two paragraphs here. Paragraph 1, paragraph 2. And let me add some more information, maybe to this one, header 2. So the header I have here, I want this one to be okay. So this is H3 here now. So this H3, I want to break it down. I want it to appear again at the end here now. Okay, H3 again. Okay, I'm going to call, instead of thunderstorm, or say what, light rain, light rain. That's another one title here. Okay, so from what I have here, okay, good. I save this page now. So these are the what I have here now. I have the A3 element. So I want to create element selector. I want all the A3 elements. I want them to be what? To be underlined, because there's A3 here, and let me assume that what? There's also what? H2 again. There is what? H2 now. So this is going to be H2 element. But what I want to do now, I want all the A3 to have a different CSS rule. A2 here is going to be what? God bless Nigeria. That's what the message my A2 will carry here now. So when I preview this page, I can see A2, I can see the I can see A2, I can see what? A3. But like this page is using some CSS file, which I'm going to change now. So I want to write a new CSS file now. So let me create a new CSS file to now change this element. Okay, I'll name the CSS here called selector. So I'm clicking my CSS folder here. I'm creating a new CSS. I call this selector. Selector.css. Okay, that is it now. So in my this one, I want to create a process which we call HTML selector. And this HTML selector, element selector, I want to apply to one, to this particular one element here, like H2. I want A2. This is going to be one. God bless our work. Again, that is it now. So if you see that on this particular page, we have A2 appear. You can see my element select. This is H1, this is H2, and this is H2, and this light rain is A3. This is the nature of it. So I want to create the HTML selector. That is, I want to apply the HTML selector to only the paragraph. So in this case again, I'm using the external word CSS. The selector name is called, the CSS file name is called selector. And when I save it, there won't be any effect because I'm not writing any CSS rule. So I will now return to my CSS file here. Let me start with a comment here now. I study, I call what? HTML or element what? Selector. Okay, good. So I am now say H2 because the CSS I want you to affect the A2 now. That is it. So this A2 is a selector. So I want the color to be red. I'll say color column what? Red now. Color column red. That is CSS rule. So moment I save this page, you will notice that what all the A2 color become red. That is it. Do you get now? That's why we call it what the HTML selector, because the CSS, this when I define the CSS rule here, I use H2. H2 is a element. It means that what any of the what element in this file that is A2, the color will automatically be what? Be red. That's what the HTML selector does. But the second type of selector, which we call what? ID selector, is like that one is going to be applied to any HTML element for a unique what? Style. If I want different type of HTML element to have the same style, maybe I want A3 and A2 for them to have the same what? Style, I can use ID selector. But when I use ID selector, I'm going to use hash symbol to define it like this. I will now specify any name of my choice. Like here now, I use the name sky. And what is the CSS rule? I want this particular selector sky to have. I say okay, text, I say text transform. Text transform is to change element to uppercase or lowercase, and now say uppercase here now. So it means that what any of the element here which I'm going to apply the ID selector to, system is going to transform them to uppercase character. So if I'm going to apply this particular ID selector, I must use ID attribute. You get now? I must use for ID attribute. I can return here now. I want the H1 to be what? ID select to be apply the ID selector. I say ID equal sky. That is it now. So, and I say this element here too. So once I prepare, can you see everything into capital letter? Maybe for example now, the H3 too, again, I can come down here, I can apply ID selector to this one, H3, by say ID equal sky. Okay, that's it. That's the first A3. So when I preview, you can see now. That means instead of me to define element selector that I'm going to affect all the A3, I want a particular A3 to have a unique CSS rule. That's why I use ID. You get now? So ID selector means you can create a CSS rule that can be applied to a particular HTML element. That is it again. But the third type of the selector we have, we call it class selector. A class selector is used when there is need to apply the same style on different elements, just like what? An ID. I want the same style to be on different element. But to define that, I have to use the dot symbol followed by any name of my choice. When I return back here again, I can now come down here and say now that I'm defining what you call the class selector. You got all this class selector now. So this class selector must be defined by use dot, and the name now. What name am I giving to that CSS? Like I said, it can be any word, any name. Do you get now? I can call the word box. I can call the word anything. I can call the word bottle like this. You get it now? And what is the CSS rule I want to be there? I can now say that the text decoration, I can say line like this, dot dot line now. Okay, dot line. And now say text decoration gonna be okay, text decoration. Okay, good. So text decoration in my another CSS rule, and now say I now want underline. You get it now? That is it. So when I say underline like that means any element I'm applying this particular one to, that is what to be system go to underline it. So if I return back to here now and I choose this paragraph, I say class what? Class equal what? Line. That means the paragraph is going to be what? Underline here. Can you see? So even though if I return back here again, if I return back here again and now say I want to apply it to what? You know I already use ID selector here. I can still use class too. If I say that what? Class equal line 2. Can say again. That means two different word selector can be applied to what? To the same word element here now. You can see it is underlined. That is it. They get it now. So that is how this particular word, this different type of selector is. But at the same time, you can still use more than one CSS selector. Let's say for example now, I'm creating another class word, class selector here again. The second class selector here, I call it dot what? Dot big. Okay, dot what? Dot great. Okay. When I say dot great now, and I say what? Borderline. I say borderline, 1 pixel and solid in color. And what type of color? I say I'm using green now. I'm using green color like this. You get now? You know there are two class selector here. So I can apply more than one selector to the same element. I want this element here that already have a class, which is this one. I want it to be what? To have that new CSL rule now, which is border. So since I already have one class selector here, the second class selector that is great here, I can also apply it. After the name of the first selector, I'll just give a space here and now type what? Great again. That is it. So once I preview this, you can see the borderline around this. So that means two different selector can be applied to, two the same selector can be applied. This one selector, this another one selector. You get it now? So what you need to understand here now is if you are going to create any CSS, you have to define the word, the selector. You can use all the three selector in a page. You can choose any of these particular three selector, whether what? The ID selector, HTML selector, or the element word selector. You get it now? So any of the selector word can be used. Like let me give example of the last one we did here, which we call what? A class word selector. We say the class selector can be defined by making use of what? Of the dot. Here now I say dot line, and I now give a text word transform, text transform, and again I now use what? Uppercase. That is it now. So this is a class selector. You must start with a dot. Specify any name. This is the ID selector. You must start with a hash. Specify any name. But this HTML selector, whereby you use the HTML word element, you want to have use the name of HTML element without the square bracket to apply to specific word HTML word element.